event for this evening is Slave Narratives, and it'll include a one-act play excerpt from James Shields, who will be joining us shortly. The main event this evening is a conversation between James Shields and Bill Andrews, moderated by Wes Daniels. Let me tell you a little bit about our participants. James Shields is the director of the Bonner Center for Community Service and Learning at Guilford College, where he earned his undergraduate degree in history and African American studies. His interest in the Underground Railroad dates back to his days as a student of noted Guilford professor Dr. Adrian Israel. For over 15 years, he has given numerous presentations on the Underground Railroad to local schools and civic groups. James also serves as one of the lead guides for Underground Railroad tours conducted on the Guilford College campus. He is well known for his work as an actor and director in the drama produced by Snow Camp Outdoor Theater, Pathway to Freedom, which depicts the local history of the Underground Railroad. Bill Andrews is E. Maynard Adams Distinguished Professor of English Emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he also served as chair of the Department of English and later Dean of Fine Arts and Humanities. His most recent book is Slavery in Class in the American South, a generation of slave narrative testimony, 1840 to 1865, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. A co-editor of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, Bill Andrews has authored or edited more than 45 books on a wide range of African American literature and culture. In 2018, the American Literature Society of the Modern Language Association conferred on Bill the J.D. Hubble Medal for Lifetime Achievement in the Study of American Literature. Our moderator, Wes Daniels, is a graduate of Malone University and Fuller Theological Seminary and is the William R. Rogers Director of Friends Center and Quaker Studies at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. Previously, he was the released Quaker minister at Camas Friends Church in Camas, Washington. In a moment, I'm going to project into the Zoom feed an excerpt from James's latest project, a one-man show depicting the life of Frederick Douglass. So thank you for your attention, and I'll get us started. Please give me a moment.
Good evening. My name is Frederick Douglass, and I want to thank you for inviting me to just share a few words with you during this Juneteenth celebration and during this pivotal time in our history. I want to share with you a time where a very transformational time for me, when I realized that slavery was a must and that I could not be a slave anymore. A time where I was able to lift myself up out of the depths of despair and to seek freedom. I want to take you to the time where I was living with Hugh Auld and his wife, Sophia. Hugh Auld was the brother of my legal master, Thomas Auld, who lived in St. Michael. Hugh Auld and Sophia lived in Baltimore, and so I was able to experience urban living, to go down to the docks, to play with the boys down at Fells Point. Miss Sophia began to teach me the ABCs. She began to teach me how to write three-letter words and the meanings of those words. Not long after that, Master Hugh found out. He was enraged. Miss Sophia didn't know any better, but he was quick to educate her in the ways of slavery, quick to educate her in the ways of withholding education and knowledge from slaves. Reading will make Fred unfit to be a slave, Sophia, he says. Indeed, I say, Because as I began to learn and as I began to gather knowledge, I understood that I, Frederick Bailey, was in fact not fit to be a slave. There was an argument between the brothers Thomas and Hugh Auld that had to do with one of my relations, Henny. Henny had been severely injured in a fire and could not do just basic tasks around the farm at St. Michael's. This frustrated Thomas Auld, who was a cruel man. Thomas Auld would barely feed us. Thomas Auld would barely give us enough cornmeal each day. And we had to work on very little. The fact that Henny could not work frustrated Thomas Auld, and he would beat her. He would string her up, and he would take cowtails and hickory sticks, and he would beat her until she was bloody. And he would let her just hang there for hours, and then he would come back and he would beat her again. Thomas Auld, after I left St. Michael and was living with the Aulds in Baltimore, tried to send Henny to Baltimore to live with Hugh. But soon Hugh found out that Henny was of no use to him as well. And he sent Henny back to Thomas Auld in St. Michael's. Thomas Auld was not happy with this arrangement, and he said, well, if you will not take Henny, you cannot keep Fred. And so I was put on a ferry, and I was sent back down the Chesapeake Bay to St. Michael's. St. Michael's was a place of cruelty. St. Michael's was a place of despair. I had been ruined, as Thomas Auld would say, by my time in Baltimore. I was an insolent slave. I would talk back to Thomas Auld. Sometimes I would simply refuse to work. Master Thomas could stand it no longer, and he decided he would resolve to have me broken. And so he sent me to a well-known slave breaker, Edward Covey. January 1st, 1834, I was sent to live with the slave breaker, Edward Covey. Edward Covey was a poor farmer. He was a slave breaker with a great reputation. Many people around the area would send their slaves to Edward Covey for a year or more to be broken. And it was a way for Edward Covey to actually get free labor on the farm that he rented. The first week I was at Edward Covey's, I received a severe whipping. The story behind that is he sent me out with a team of oxen to go get wood, firewood. This was the first time I had ever been a field hand, and I had no experience as a young teenager working with oxen. But he sent me out anyway. I got to the woods easy enough, and as I began to load the ox cart with wood, the ox just ran away. The cart dashing to tree, being damaged. The oxen are all over the place. It took me half a day to gather the oxen, to get them back onto the cart. And when I finally loaded the cart, I went back to the Edward Covey farm. As we approached the farm, the oxen went wild again, and they started running all over the place. They dashed the cart against the gate, broke the gate, and of course, Mr. Covey was not happy, and he gave me a severe beating. He leapt upon me, tore my clothes off, and he beat me. A beating that left deep lashes. Lashes that I would feel for the rest of my life. Lashes that were irritated under the harsh material of the clothes that we would wear, or the sweat. Deep gashes in my back. Six months of constant whipping on the Edward Covey farm broke me. We would work from sun up to sundown. For Mr. Covey, it was never too hot. For Mr. Covey, it was never too cold. No day was long enough for us to work. Work is all we knew. I was in such despair that when we did have time off, I would simply find a tree and I would sit. I did not want to read. I was not interested in intellect, and I just wanted to sit. If at any one time of my life that I have tasted the bitterest dregs of slavery, it was during those 6 months with Edward Covey. I was broken in body and mind and spirit. My elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished. My desire to read dissipated. The dark night of slavery was upon me. Behold, a man transformed into a brute. There was a time, though, after 6 months of this brutality, after 6 months of this cruelty, there was a breaking point. There was a time during this time with Edward Covey that I even considered taking my own life. One day we were in the field and we were fanning wheat. It was so hot that day. We had had little water, and I passed out, going into convulsions. I was having heat stroke. I could not work. I crawled over to what little bit of shade was there in the field, and Covey leapt out from nowhere as he was wont to do. He came over to me and told me to get up and work. I told him that I could not. He kicked me in the stomach. He grabbed a hickory stick and he began wailing on me and hitting me on the head. Blood was flowing profusely from my head and from the rest of my body. He beat me to the point that I could not take it any longer, and I ran off. And I ran off into the woods. I ran off into the woods. Eventually, I met another bondsman, Sandy. Sandy was on his way to see his wife that lived on another plantation, and he took me there. And they fed me, and they dressed my wounds. Now, Sandy was what I call an old African, and Sandy shared with me a root that he said would protect me. Of course, I was skeptical of such a thing, such superstition. Sandy reminded me that all my book learning hadn't saved me thus far from the cruelty of Edward Covey, and I considered it was worth it. And so I stuck the root in my pocket and I headed back to Edward Covey, not knowing what I would find. As I walked up to the Edward Covey farm, I meet him and his wife, and they're headed to church as it was the Sabbath day. Edward Covey was a very devout Christian, and he did not beat his slaves on the Sabbath day. He simply said, "Hello, Frederick." And he gave me a few tasks to do while he was going to church, and I obeyed. Monday was a different story. Monday morning, I was asked to feed and brush and curry the horses, which I was glad to do. I had decided at this point that whatever I was asked to do, I would do it without question. So I went to the barn, and I'm going up to the barn to get blades of grass for the horses. And as I'm coming down the ladder, Covey jumps out from nowhere, like he always does, with a rope. And he tries to grab me by the legs. He tries to grab me by the legs, and before he could tie the rope around my legs, I fall back off the ladder, and I fall on top of him, and then we begin to grapple. And it was then that I decided. I do not know where it came from. I do not know where the sense of survival and self-defense came from, but it was then that I decided that I would fight. It was then that I decided that I was tired of being treated as a brute, and I would have it no longer. We both grabbed each other, and I grabbed him by the throat, and I lifted both of us up. The blood was flowing from my fingernails, from my hands around his neck. I cannot tell you the feeling that I had when I was grabbing him and seeing the look in his eyes, because he was surprised. He was surprised that I would even think or have the audacity to fight him. And we tussled and we went back and forth. There was a large stick outside of the barn where we were fighting, and he tried to drag us over to that stick so that he could use it, but I wasn't having that. And I grabbed him even harder, more blood flowing from him. Then he calls out to one of his men, Hughes. Hughes comes with a rope and attempts to tie my hand. And as he came to tie my hand, I gave a swift kick to Hughes's ribs, which sickened him. And he just scurried off. You should have seen the look in Covey's eyes. As I still held him by the neck, his eyes were just amazed that I was continuing to do this. "Will you persist on resisting me?" And I said, "Yes. I will be a brute no longer. I will tolerate this from you no longer." And so we continue to tussle. And then he calls Bill, another hired slave from another master. He calls Bill, "Come over, help. Now, of course, Bill knew what he wanted, but Bill says, "So what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do?" Grab him, you fool." And Bill says, well, my master didn't send me here to do that. My master sent me here to work. My master didn't send me here to fight Fred. And Bill went on his way. And so we continued to fight. 2 hours. We tussled. Never letting go. After 2 hours of rolling around and fighting and grabbing, Covey let me go. Huffing, puffing, bleeding from the neck, bruises all over. And he says, if you had not resisted, I would not have beat you as bad. When in fact, he had not beat me at all. It was I who drew blood from him, and him, not from me. It was I that held the high ground during this tussle. The next 6 months of living with Edward Covey, he never laid another finger on me. Every now and then, when he was frustrated with my work or just wanted to say something, he would say, "Don't make me get a hold of you like I did last time." And I thought to myself, yes, you best not, or you're going to get it worse than you did the last time. I've always been curious as to why he did not take me to the constable. Resisting a master, assaulting a master, was almost a capital offense if you were a slave. You were sent to the whipping post, 39 lashes at least. But his reputation was at stake as a top slave breaker. And if word had gotten out that I had bested him, that I resisted him, that I in fact assaulted and drew blood from him, his reputation and his way of life would have ended. And so he did not say anything. He did not take me to the constable, and I was not whipped. This fight was the turning point in my life. This fight was the turning point in me deciding that I could no longer be a slave. It rekindled those dying embers of freedom that Covey had tried to put out. The self-confidence that was going away. The crushed spirit began to arise. The cowardice that was in me was replaced with bold defiance. I resolved that day that though I may be a slave in form, that I was not a slave in fact. The white man that sought to whip me must also seek to kill me, for I would never be whipped again.
James, who has joined us now, tell us about how this encounter with Covey ends.
Yeah, so you asked about the story. I don't know how far into the story people got. But basically, he had his fight with Edward Covey. It was, to his account, it was over 2 hours. And the result was that he was able to lift himself up out of a pretty deep malaise. You know, he even talks in one of his writings. He talks even that he thought about suicide even. He was that deep. He says that this fight was his turning point. It was when he decided that he would no longer be treated as a brute. It was when he decided that even if he was a slave in form, that he was not a slave in fact. And even though it was 4 years before he actually was able to escape, he tells us that he was never beaten again. He made it clear that anyone who sought to succeed in whipping him must also succeed in killing him. He went back to Thomas Auld. He ended up going to another master. He did try to escape, and he didn't make it, at least the first time. But of course, we know that he did escape 4 years later, dressed as a sailor. So that's just part of the story. But this was but he will tell you that this was a pivotal event in his life. What's interesting, I will say, and I know Bill can talk more on this as well. Most people, I think most people know that, he wrote basically 3 different autobiographies. And so he tells this story 3 different times at 3 different points in his life. And so it's interesting to see how he tells this story. When he first told the story, you don't hear a whole lot about the hired man that tried to help Covey. You don't always hear about the, actually there was a woman who worked for Covey, and he called her over to help against Fred, and she decided not to do it. It just seemed like Covey picked the wrong day, and everybody was saying, no, we're not doing what you want us to do. So I would encourage people to find those stories in the 3 different books, because the differences are pretty interesting. And then if you look back in terms of when he wrote them, I think it makes for pretty interesting reading.
I'd like to chime in with James on this. The version that most people think about in terms of Frederick Douglass's autobiography is the version he wrote when he was 27 years old in 1845. But 10 years later, he wrote his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And when he describes the fight with Edward Covey, and the reason why I'm calling him Covey is because that's the way his name would have been pronounced on the Eastern Shore. He makes it very explicit in My Bondage and My Freedom. He says, I was strictly on the defensive through this, what he calls a scuffle. It's his word, not mine. Strictly on a defensive. I was not going to allow him to injure me, and I did not try to injure him. So he did not avail himself of any kind of weapon. He did not try to beat Covey with his fists. What he did was he defeated Covey psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
He defeated him psychologically because he refused to allow Covey to whip him. And as a result, Covey never threatened him again. He also stood up to Covey in a way that set an example for the others in the party whom he worked with, which consisted of a woman named Caroline, who was Covey's only slave. He owned her. And when she refused to help him throttle Frederick, she was going to pay a big price for that, because he owned her and he could do with her as he pleased. So Douglass says, we were all in open rebellion that morning. When he says we, he means all of the Black folks who were working for Covey, either those who were hired to him, like Frederick, or Bill Smith, or Caroline, who was not hired, who actually belonged to him legally. So Douglass found, not only in that moment when he resisted Covey and would not allow him to defeat him or do violence to him, he found a way to inspire other slaves to be resistors too. And he really stresses that in his second autobiography, that was part of what he wanted to do, was to take a stand and then become known for it. As James said, Douglass wanted people to know that he would fight. He would not take anything that was dished out unless he dished back as strongly as he got.
Thank you both. I wonder if there are comments or questions for James or Bill at this point. We don't have anything in the chat, so you can either put it there or you can use the little thing to raise your hand on the screen, and we can go that way too.
I might say something about why Thomas Auld sent Frederick Bailey to Covey's for a year. And it has to do with a theme of my book, Slavery and Class in the American South. Frederick Bailey had been a fortunate enslaved boy from the Eastern Shore when he was selected among hundreds of enslaved boys on the Edward Lloyd plantation to be sent to Baltimore. And Douglass says in his autobiographies, I was the only one selected for this. Out of all the possibilities on a plantation that had reportedly 1,000 enslaved men and women and children, Frederick Bailey was the only one who got what Douglass called, and I'm quoting him, the high privilege of leaving the Eastern Shore and going to Baltimore. That was a tremendous step up, because he talks about how Frederick knew it was a great deal. It was a great opportunity. He talks about how he had free time that he could go and play with white boys down on the docks at Fells Point. Frederick Bailey didn't know anything about picking cotton or doing agricultural labor until he was 16 years old, and Thomas Auld had got so mad at Hugh Auld that he said, "Send me my slave back." He'd been living in the city, and he'd been able to come and go with remarkable freedom, even for a city slave. But Douglass said in the narrative from 1845, he said a city slave compared to a rural slave is almost a free person, because city slaves have so many advantages. That puts many city slaves in a certain kind of status. The same way we think, a lot of people think today, you're more sophisticated, you're in a different status if you come from a big city than if you come from out in the country somewhere. Well, when Frederick came back to St. Michael's, he discovered that Thomas Auld was, and he treated him as, kind of a countrified pseudo slaveholder who didn't have enough money to buy his own slaves. He had to depend on his wife and her slaves to make him a slaveholder. And Douglass wouldn't even call Thomas Auld master. He says this in one of his autobiographies. He said, I called him Captain Auld, because he was the captain of a sloop that went back and forth between the Eastern Shore and Baltimore. So he's what Douglass would have called himself, an impudent slave. And it's that impudence, it's that sense of, I am a self-respecting person, I don't respect you. You may be my master, but I don't respect you. And every time Auld would ask him to do something, he was liable to get back talk from Frederick. These are all ways that Frederick was saying, in some ways, you know, I'm above you. You may be master and I may be slave, but I know more, I'm stronger, I'm more intelligent, and I know you're a phony. I know you're a fraud. I know that you're a hypocrite, and I don't want anything to do with you. And so Thomas Sowell tells him, your city ways are just impossible for me to bear, so I'm sending you to Edward Covey. Your city ways, that's another way of talking about his kind of sense of himself, his status, his sense of class. And it's that conflict between his caste status as a slave and his class behavior as a sophisticated city guy, despite the fact that he's African American, that just galls Thomas Sowell to the point where he just can't stand it any longer. So he sends him to become a common field hand. He demotes him down to the bottom rank and puts him under a slave breaker on top of that, and says basically, see how you like this.
All right, thank you for that. Looks like we have a question for both of you from Noel. The different narratives are reflective of different historical moments in America. Can you comment on that collectively? The different narratives are reflective of different historical, cultural moments in America.
Well, I can say something about it. In 1845, Frederick Douglass was working for the American Anti-Slavery Society as a lecturer. A former slave at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder has become a white-collar worker. He makes his living giving speeches. A man who never had a day's schooling in his life. Talk about catapulting up the class ladder. He did it. But when he's working for William Lloyd Garrison, the American Anti-Slavery Society, he also has to follow their line. He has to articulate their attitudes towards how slavery should be overcome. And that means that he has to soft pedal whatever violence he may have wanted to do or may have done. He has to emphasize that he did not want this fight. He didn't choose to fight. He didn't use violence. He was in control of his violence all the time, and he controlled this white man's violence. So this was all in keeping with the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was a strictly pacifist organization. In 1855, when Douglass wrote My Bondage and My Freedom, he had had a big falling out with William Lloyd Garrison, and he'd been kicked out of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He was treated as Douglass called an apostate. So there are places in My Bondage and My Freedom where Douglass says that if a slave kills his master, he's justified in doing so because that master is a tyrant and that slave is doing nothing more than what the Revolutionary Fathers did in 1776. He doesn't change the way he describes his battle with Covey, but he does make it very clear in 1855 that his politics has become much more aggressive, and he's no longer Garrison's man. He doesn't work for Garrison. He's not going to toe Garrison's line. He's going to be an independent, and he writes like one.
James, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add to that other than, yeah, you're right. He, when he first started giving his speeches, I think there was a point where he was more of or he felt like he was more of a spectacle. He was more of that kind of person that's trying to just put out there, as opposed to, I'm Frederick Douglass. He started to get more political in his speeches, and people like Garrison and others didn't like that. And he was actually told, you need to tone it down, to stick with the stories, right? And he wasn't for that. He had developed a pretty keen political philosophy especially as it related to slavery, as it related to politics, as it related to Christianity, and how all those things came together. So he was a very good, very articulate critique of the church and its role in slavery, of the political system. Of course, we all know about the famous July 4th speech. And so he became less of a storyteller. Let me tell you the story of Ed Covey. Let me tell you the story of that. No, let me tell you about yourselves. And that made a lot of people nervous, because he did it very well. You can tell that when he gave his analysis, that it was very thought out and it was on point. And a lot of people didn't like that.
Okay, I've got another question here. I understand it took Douglass a while to get along with Lincoln. What got him to accept Lincoln?
The Emancipation Proclamation. Douglass knew that Lincoln was a colonizationist.
Mm-hmm.
That is, he was a white person who was opposed to slavery, but wanted the slaves sent someplace else after they were freed. Yep. He said that. I mean, he didn't hide it. He said it. He told a group of black people in the White House that that's what he thought. Mm-hmm. And so Lincoln had a long ways to go to get to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Douglass knew it was primarily a political instrument. It's ironic to hear people talk about the Emancipation Proclamation on Juneteenth as the thing that ended slavery, except for a place like Texas where people didn't know they'd been freed until June of 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, didn't free any slaves, because the slaves that the Emancipation Proclamation said were free were the slaves in, it's very clearly stated in the proclamation, in the rebellious states, by which Lincoln meant the states in the Confederacy. He had no power to free slaves in the Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation was for Douglass an immensely important symbolic action. And he respected Lincoln tremendously for doing it, even though it really didn't have any power. And in fact, it didn't free the slaves that Lincoln could have freed. It didn't free any slaves in the border states that hadn't seceded. It didn't free any slaves in Kentucky. It didn't free any slaves in Maryland. Didn't free any slaves in Delaware or Missouri. Those were all border states that had not seceded. Lincoln did not want them to secede. So he didn't say anything about freeing any slaves in any states except for the ones in rebellion. Nevertheless, Frederick Douglass, I mean, he knew all of that. He understood that. He still thought Lincoln had taken a tremendous step forward, and he definitely became a supporter and campaigned for him vigorously in 1864 when Lincoln was running for re-election, and for a long time it looked like he might go down to defeat.
All right, friends, are there other comments or questions that you'd like to ask at this time? Okay. Another question: how does Douglass's narrative fit with your edited collection, Moses, Horton, etc.?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, I was a general editor of a volume called North Carolina Slave Narrative, which I co-edited with several of my graduate students. And so there are 4 narratives by African-American men who were enslaved at some time in North Carolina. Their stories are certainly important. They're not as famous, of course, any of them, as the hugely and justifiably famous African-American woman from North Carolina whose autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is an absolute classic. And she grew up and was enslaved her whole life in Edenton, North Carolina. But Douglass was not unlike Lunsford Lane, an African-American who just had a historical marker put up in the state capitol grounds commemorating the life and work of Lunsford Lane, who published his autobiography 3 years before Douglass published his. Lunsford Lane was, like Douglass, a very skilled enslaved man. And like Douglass, he came from a family that really instilled in him a great deal of ambition and self-confidence, which Douglass also had instilled in him from the time he grew up with his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who had a huge impact on his life. If you only read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass of 1845, Betsy Bailey is barely mentioned.
Yeah.
But if you read My Bondage and My Freedom, he talks a lot about Betsy Bailey and what an impressive person she was. Lunsford Lane was unlike Douglass in that he tried to buy his freedom and in fact succeeded. But what made him and Douglass similar was that they both were so enterprising. Frederick Douglass, James mentioned that after the second time Frederick Douglass was hired out after Covey, he was sent back to Baltimore. And when he was sent back to Baltimore, his master, Thomas Auld, said, "I'm going to have you trained as a ship's caulker." That means he's going to turn his slave, who had been dissing him and treating him, like he was not someone to admire at all, had no reason to be nice to Frederick Bailey, but he says, "I'm going to get you trained so that you could be a caulker and basically hire your own time and live and work in Baltimore," which he did. He reached kind of the ceiling of the class ladder among the enslaved, in that he hired his own time and worked for wages. What galled him was that he had to pay Hugh Auld every week, even though Hugh Auld didn't do anything except have the power to extract money from him every week. But Lunsford Lane was a tremendously skilled man. He actually started a business while he was a slave with his father in Raleigh, North Carolina. They cured tobacco and sold it in Raleigh, in Chapel Hill, and in Fayetteville. They had franchises while they were both enslaved. That's the kind of enterprise that these men displayed. So there's some really interesting similarities between Douglass and the men who are in North Carolina slave narratives. Thanks for mentioning the book. It tells you a lot about slavery in North Carolina, which was very different from what a lot of people think slavery was like across the South. North Carolina was in some ways pretty different as a slaveholding state.
I guess I had a question actually for Bill. Just one, this book is really incredible, but as we were talking about the different names and the names that I have heard, but I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about the fact that most of the slave narratives that we hear are, the Harriet Jacobs, the Frederick Douglass. We don't always get that common enslaved person.
You're exactly
you've
right.
got, you've
exactly
got
right.
the recent release Barracoon, for example, from Zora Neale Hurston. That's pretty when it comes to this idea of class within the enslaved, this guy was pretty low on the ladder there, compared
Yeah.
to Frederick Douglass and some of these other folks.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's one reason why I wrote my book. My book concerns all the slave narratives that were published between 1840 and 1865, 61 slave narratives. The majority of those slave narratives have received little or no attention. And I can tell you the slave narratives that have received the least attention are almost always the ones by people whose primary work in the time that they were enslaved was in agricultural labor.
Mm-hmm.
So it says something about our class views today that scholars tend to be more interested in the higher echelon slaves, or former slaves, like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown and Harriet Jacobs, William and Ellen Craft. There's nothing wrong with studying those people, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're magnificent people, and their stories are utterly fascinating. But the James Roberts is not exactly a household name. People like Watson, Thomas Watson, other people who, Israel Campbell, people who are not in the pantheon of big time people, are often people who worked in the fields and who managed to escape and then published their autobiographies, but they didn't have anti-slavery societies behind them. They didn't have a story that everyone wanted to hear. So in many cases, they had to publish the stories themselves, which meant that they didn't get a lot of circulation. They didn't get read that widely. They didn't get reviewed. So people don't know that the first slave narrative, in many cases, people are not aware that the first fugitive slave narrative in American literature was published by William Grimes in 1825. And William Grimes had been primarily an agricultural worker. And it keeps on going. You have narratives by John Andrew Jackson, for instance, who was who worked in the fields in South Carolina, or John Brown, who worked in the fields in Georgia, and they wrote narratives. They were published, but they don't get the attention. Yeah, James, there's a lot to be said about those people, and I do discuss all of them and all of their narratives in my book because they deserve to be much better known.
Looks like we've got two kind of related questions. So let me read them both, and at least the second one is directed at James. So from Tom, might Douglass's impudence in the narrative we heard be what we are inheriting on a mass scale today, saying enough, no more? And then the second question is, how does performance hold potential for spreading awareness of Douglass and the potential of current protests?
Well, I think anytime we can portray someone, different sides of someone like Douglass, I think it's important. If you only are exposed, for example, to how he's portrayed, let's say in various movies, we haven't had a movie about him, but you really don't get to see the different dimensions of Douglass. I have tried to what I have done, at least the full performance that I've done, and it's almost an hour and a half. And what I decided to do, that instead of sticking with one of the three narratives, that I actually just kind of melded them all together. And so that I was able to spend, for example, I early on, I spend a pretty good amount of time on his grandmother, because as Bill said, she was crucial. I tried to portray the sadness as he talked about how she died by herself after raising all these kids. And then she's in that cabin just by herself. I do believe, for me, because I am not, though I do go to protests, I do this and that. I do work with young people in terms of social justice. But for me, one of the best ways for me to contribute to that work is through performance. Yes, you're right. This, for example, the fight with Covey, you said Covey, right? He, enough was enough. And I think that's what you're hearing in the streets, not just from the young people, but old heads like myself. And I even think about people like my mother, who is still alive, and she's seeing this. And I even wonder what she's thinking as we see this going on. Because I know for me, I'm thinking, wow, are we still here? Are we still doing this? And I think the story of Frederick Douglass, I think the story, I just came from another thing where we're talking about the story of the Underground Railroad, where people decided, I'm not waiting for somebody to free me. I'm not waiting for somebody to give me freedom or somebody to manumit me. I'm going to do this. And I think that's what we're seeing now. Those of you that know me know that for about 18 years, I was performing in a play called Pathway to Freedom. And this was a play about the Underground Railroad as it operated here in Guilford County and in Alamance County. And I was just going back and forth on Facebook with some of the former cast members, and we kept talking about how this is a show that needs to be seen right now in terms of the theme of the show, the idea of freedom and why freedom is so important. But it also speaks to the idea of not, even though you've been oppressed, even though you've been wronged, not seeking revenge, because that's a major part of the show as well. Because one of the main characters in the show, who's an enslaved African, he has every reason to get revenge. He has every reason to try to kill the people who perpetrated these things on him and his family, but he doesn't. And I think that's where we are now, because on the one hand, we have people who are fearful that folks are out for revenge. But on the other hand, we have people that simply just want to live and be left alone and to be treated, a certain way. And if I have an encounter with the cops, I don't want to be scared. I don't want my kids growing up thinking I see a cop car and I'm like, oh, my dad was a cop for 30 some years. And so I grew up in that environment. And so it's sad for me to see these kids, you see a cop and all of a sudden you're like, you're afraid. So I think performance is crucial. The arts are crucial, and we're seeing that right now. And I decided a long time ago to try to do something with Frederick Douglass. It's a project that still is in development. I can do it, but there's so much more. The thing that's lucky, I've got probably, looking back here in my bookshelf, at least 10 to 12 books on Frederick Douglass, right? But most of them are his own words. And so the script is written. It's just a matter. So that's the easy part. But the hard part is, how do you portray that? From what I've read, he from time to time, he wasn't consistently, at least as he went farther on, he wasn't this angry person on the stage, right? The words were angry. The words were accusatory, but they weren't done in a way where you would scare people, right? And so I'm trying to find the balance between the anger that's there, but also how he had to kind of rein himself in, not to scare people. But yeah, it is something that I hope to continue to do. And so that's why I got to keep my hair like this. I had a wig, but it looked stupid. I didn't like it. So I decided just to grow my hair. But yeah, but I think it really is important when you think about some of the movies that have come out. Harriet, uh, for example, not the movie I would have made, but I do know that it introduced her to a lot of people in ways that she had not been introduced before. I wish they had spent more time. Someone who has taken students down to the Sea Islands for the last 12 years now, I wish they had spent more time on her time at St. Helena Island and what she did there before they did the raids on the Combahee River. That in itself, I think, would be an incredible movie. So maybe that's a sequel they might do for us.
Well, thank you, James. Thank you,
Yeah.
Bill. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom and the ways in which you've brought Frederick Douglass to life for us today. I'm going to hand and thank you everyone for coming and participating in this. We've
Thank you.
come to the end of our time. So I'm going to
All
hand it
right.
over to Andrew.
Let me echo Wes and thanking all of our participants today, also especially Wes for moderating. Thank you very much. I would like to end with a reminder to check out future Greensboro Bound programs through our Facebook page, and also a reminder that William Andrews' book can be found through Scuppernong. It is Slavery in Class in the American South, a generation of slave narrative testimony, 1840 to 1865. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to be able to see you again at another Greensboro Bound event.